Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Standage, and I'm Deputy Editor of The Economist. And on behalf of The Economist and Economist Impact, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the World Ahead 2025 Athens Gala Dinner. Thank you all for being here. It's great to be here in Athens once again. And thank you also to our sponsors. And you can see them all listed here, but we'd particularly like to thank Capital Maritime and Trading, Navios Partners, They, and Optima Bank. We have a great program for you tonight with some very distinguished guest speakers, and we're going to discuss the outlook for the coming year in geopolitics, economics, trade, and so forth. But we're going to start with the view from The Economist and some of the predictions in this year's edition of The World Ahead, which you have on the table in front of you. So that's my department, because I am also the editor of The World Ahead. So The World Ahead is our annual where we try to figure out what's going to happen in the coming year. And you can see covers of previous editions here on this slide. It's written by the same journalists that write The Economist. And we're also joined by our colleagues at the Economist Intelligence Unit, the B2B arm of The Economist, and they provide forecasts for 15 industries and 81 countries. And we also have guest writers who write for us. And this year, our guests include Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, writing about economic reform; Edgars Rinkēvičs, the president of Latvia, writing about European security; and Fei-Fei Li, the godmother of AI. It was at her lab at Stanford that the modern AI boom began. We also have a very interesting character, an entrepreneur writing for us this year, called Casey Handmer. And he reminds me of Elon Musk 20 years ago. So sort of good Elon, if you like. So check out what he has to say about the energy transition. Anyway, my job as editor is to get all of these different people to send me their copy, and then to figure out what the common strands are, what the common themes are that run through it all. And so this is my top 10 letter, and I'm going to go through my top 10 with you now. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that the biggest theme of the year is the impact of the re-election of Donald Trump. And this is going to affect everything from immigration and defense to economics and trade, not just in America, but around the world. The trouble is, there's huge uncertainty over what Donald Trump will or won't do. He's said a lot of things. He said he would impose enormous tariffs to help rebuild American manufacturing. He said he would deport millions of unauthorized immigrants. He said he would end the war in Ukraine in a single day. And he said he would cut taxes. Sometimes he talks about getting rid of income tax altogether and reduce government bureaucracy with a bit of help from Elon Musk. So that's what he said. And the big question is, what's he actually going to do? He'll probably do some version of some of these things, but how far he'll go and which ones he'll prioritize, we just don't know. So there's a lot of room for uncertainty and a lot of scope for potentially quite massive changes. And that brings us to the second theme, which is that voters expect change. We had an unprecedented year of elections in 2024 around the world, more people voting than ever before in history. And what the results have in common is that incumbent ruling parties did badly. It wasn't a move to the left or the right or a move towards nationalism or away from it. It was just whoever was in charge did badly. We had a right-wing government chucked out in Britain. We had a left-wing government chucked out in America. We had some governments forced into coalition, like in India and in South Africa. And we had other governments forced into cohabitation or minority rule, as in Taiwan and France. So 2025 is a year of expectations. Can the new leaders deliver on their promises? And will those leaders who were humbled by these results change their ways? And going back to Trump, no one has promised more change than he has. And in particular, there are two areas where the world is holding its breath to see what he's going to do. The first is geopolitics. Despite his promise, Donald Trump has not ended the war in Ukraine in a single day. So what is he going to do? It's very hard to tell. Will he stop aid to Ukraine and propose a deal with Vladimir Putin that lets Russia keep the parts of Ukraine that it's conquered? That's what a lot of people are expecting. If so, the big question is, will America provide any security guarantees to Ukraine to protect it from Russian aggression in the future? If Donald Trump forces Ukraine into a lopsided deal, Vladimir Putin will have won, and it will also send a signal that American promises are empty, and that would encourage troublemaking by China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. In the Middle East, Donald Trump seems inclined to give Israel a free hand in its conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon. Ceasefires at the moment, we hope they'll hold, but we don't know what will happen. More broadly, though, those around Donald Trump argue that America is overstretched, needs to focus on China, and therefore has to pay less attention to what's happening in Europe and the Middle East. But even in the Asia-Pacific theatre, given Donald Trump's more transactional approach to alliances, it's unclear whether America would actually stand up to China in the event of a conflict in the South China Sea, perhaps with the Philippines, or if there was to be a crisis over Taiwan. Donald Trump thinks this unpredictability is a sort of deterrent, but we don't really know how true that will be. And if it comes to be seen as empty bluster, that could embolden America's foes. The other big question is trade, and we're going to be talking about this a lot, I think, this evening. Donald Trump keeps threatening to impose tariffs on imports to America from friends and foes alike, but does he really mean it? And if so, how far will he go? Will he really impose a 60% tariff on goods from China? As we saw in the recent spat with Colombia, just in the last few days, Trump used the threat of tariffs to get something he wanted, to get Colombia to accept military aircraft carrying deported migrants. So this could all just be a negotiating ploy. Let's hope it is, because last time America tried blanket tariffs was in 1930 with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, and global trade fell by 2/3. So if there were to be these big tariffs, it could affect America's growth and it could affect global growth really quite badly. China, Mexico, and Canada would be particularly hard hit as America's closest trading partners. And China is already struggling to meet its 5% growth target. And that brings us to what's happening in clean tech. China's economy is in a mess because its property industry collapsed, so the government's plan is export-led growth, and in particular, booming exports of solar panels, batteries, and electric cars to try to offset the weakness of its domestic economy. Now, this is a mixed blessing for the world. On the one hand, many companies and many countries are worried about the impact this will have on them because they can't compete with China's low prices. America, Canada, and the EU have imposed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, for example. And America has been aggressively subsidizing its own clean tech industries. On the other hand, cheap Chinese exports are good for the world because they mean that clean tech is available at very low prices, and adoption of solar panels and grid storage has been shooting up and repeatedly outstripping forecasts. Developing countries can buy clean technology at a very low price. There's been a huge expansion of solar in Pakistan, for example. So that's good news. And we may get more good news in 2025 because we may soon find out whether global greenhouse gas emissions have peaked. It all depends on the latest figures from China, which were due just at the end of last month. Some analysts think that China's emissions peaked in 2020 and have been falling since then. And if that's true, then the trajectory of global emissions will also have passed its peak. We don't know whether it will be the case or not, but we should find out soon. And obviously that would be a big milestone on the way to dealing with the climate change problem. And even though Donald Trump is a climate change skeptic, he can't stop the energy transition. Let's stay with economics. Inflation has been the main thing on policymakers' minds for the past few years, but advanced economies must now confront the challenge of reducing their deficits. The G7 countries are on average running a deficit of 6% of GDP, and this is completely unsustainable. America is spending more on servicing its debt than it is on defence, which is saying something because it's the world's biggest spender on defence. Now, we didn't hear much about this in last year's elections because you don't tend to win election by promising to increase taxes and cutting spending. But that's what many governments now potentially have to do unless they can somehow engineer a burst of growth, which also seems pretty unlikely. To make matters worse, many countries also want to increase their defence spending because Donald Trump says he wants NATO countries to boost their spending. And this is going to make budgets even harder to balance. And if this wasn't difficult enough, Donald Trump's trade policies would also reduce growth across the board and threaten to reignite inflation. So basically, painful economic choices are going to have to be made. Austerity is back on the agenda for many countries, and I'm sure we'll be talking more about this later on as well. Okay, on to the question of a subject much discussed in 2024 because Joe Biden was prevailed upon to step aside because he was too old, and then America elected its oldest ever president-elect anyway. So we thought we'd look at the numbers. As they are going up around the world, they're going up even faster in autocratic countries where, of course, rulers try to stay in power until they die, very often. In democracies, though, the average age of leaders is actually going down. So there are now 4 leaders under the age of 45 in democracies. There were none 50 years ago. The big outlier here is America because it's got a very, very old gerontocracy, a very, very old set of lawmakers. And that's just a weird aspect of America's political system. But I think we can expect to hear more discussion of age limits for elected leaders this year. And this is already happening in some parts of the world. Okay, next up is AI, which is very much in the news right now. 2025 is shaking up to be a crunch year for artificial intelligence. Something like $1.5 trillion is going into AI infrastructure, data centers, servers, chips, and so on. And yet, most companies are not using AI yet. You'd expect American firms to be ahead of the pack, but only 5 or 6% of them say they're using AI in their products and services. So something doesn't add up. Where are the customers who are going to pay to use all of this expensive infrastructure? If you ask people in the industry, they say, well, it takes time to adopt a new technology, you have to change your processes, you have to retrain workers, you have to reorganize your data. So just wait a bit and the revenue will come along soon. But just in the last couple of days, there's been a huge panic about the scale of AI investment and whether it's all been a mistake. DeepSeek, a Chinese startup, has released a set of AI models that are just as good as the best Western models, but were created at a tiny fraction of the cost. And we've seen the share prices of NVIDIA and other big AI companies fall as a result. This suggests you don't need thousands and thousands of chips to build a state-of-the-art system. And these Chinese models are also very cheap to run, undercutting the prices of Western firms. So a bit like with the clean technology, this is a mixed blessing. It's bad news if you're NVIDIA or OpenAI and you were hoping to charge lots of money for AI-related things. But it's good news for most companies because it means that really good AI is going to be much less expensive than they thought. And that means you can use it in more places. So that brings us back to the question of what's really holding back the adoption of AI. And I think it really is more of a cultural and management challenge than a technological challenge. So the big question for this year is, will we see a significant pickup in adoption of AI? Because if we don't, the slump that we saw yesterday could turn into a crash. Next up, travel. The global travel patterns are being reconfigured as airlines avoid conflict zones or flying over unfriendly countries. If you fly from New York to Delhi, it takes 2 hours longer if you go on an American airline than if you go on an Indian airline, because Indian airlines are willing to fly over Russia. So this is making it harder to get around, and British Airways has just cancelled, I think, its direct flights to Beijing. People are starting to pay attention to this, and the number of conflicts around the world is very concerning for airlines. There's also been a backlash against over-tourism in many parts of Europe, and we've seen Amsterdam, Barcelona, also New York introducing restrictions on short-term rentals. Venice has introduced an entry fee. Pompeii is capping visitors, lots of things like that. So what's going on? Well, basically, tourism has rebounded very quickly after the pandemic, back up to its pre-pandemic level, a little bit higher actually for the first time in 2024, and that has meant year-on-year growth rates of about 50%. And that feels like, and I'm sure you felt that here in Athens, that feels like a lot of people suddenly showing up in your country. But what we think will happen this year is that the growth rate of tourist arrivals will go back to something closer to its pre-pandemic rate of 5 to 10% a year. So the concern about over-tourism, we think, should subside. But all of those restrictions that have been put in place will remain. Finally, 2024 has been a surprising year. We had 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump. We had exploding walkie-talkies in Lebanon. We had the world's biggest rocket being captured as it came back from space by the world's biggest pair of chopsticks. Fiction-sounding things. So I think one lesson of 2024 is that unbelievable things seem to be happening more often than we expect. Attention to other implausible but possible things that could happen this year. And I have a list of them in the world ahead that you can check out. But just to give you a couple of examples, could there be a really big solar storm that knocks out satellites and the power grid for a few months and causes trillions of dollars worth of damage? The last time we had a really big solar storm was in 1859, and back then we didn't have any satellites and we didn't have a power grid. But if we had a storm like that today, the damage would be enormous. Another concern I think people are very worried about now is another pandemic, and in particular this new strain of bird flu that is on the rise around the world, but seems to be infecting the farm animals in America now, and we've had the first human fatality. That's causing a lot of people to worry. But it's not all bad news. We're going to see some fun things, I think, this year as well. We're probably next month going to see the first mobile 4G network on the moon. So think of the roaming charges if you tried to use that. And then we're also potentially going to see new discoveries made with the analysis of carbonized scrolls from Pompeii, using AI to recover ancient texts. So I'm particularly hoping that we see some progress on that front. But I think the broader point is that to see the future more clearly, it can help to anticipate the unlikely. So you can read all about all of these things on our website and in the world ahead, which you have on the tables in front of you. And I wish you the best of luck in navigating the coming year, whatever surprises it may bring. Thank you for listening.